Montana Territory, January 1883. The sound of gunfire cracked through the frozen trees just as Raelle Ellison's boots hit the riverbank, breath white in the bitter air. Her skirts were torn, blood on her sleeve, and snow clung to her lashes. She did not stop running. Behind her, the hooves of two riders beat hard against the crusted snow. She had seen their faces, men from the camp, the ones who'd taken her father's land after his death last spring. Sheriff did nothing. Now they wanted silence. But she had heard too much. The Bitterroot River stretched before her, iced over but thin near the center. The woods to the other side meant safety. She did not hesitate. Her foot hit the first crack before she was halfway across. Another step, and the ice gave way beneath her. The water swallowed her in one breathless pull, cold like knives. Her scream vanished under the surface. Her hands clawed for the edges, but they slipped frozen, slick. The current tugged at her skirts, dragging her down. Her lungs burned. Then a shadow above. A splash. He hit the water feet first, breaking the surface with a shout. Big hands gripped her arms, pulling hard, kicking against the current. She gasped when they broke the surface, coughing, shaking, alive. "Hold on to me," he said, voice rough with cold. "I got you." She could not see his face clearly, only the soaked brim of a hat and his jaw clenched tight. But his arms were strong, steady. He dragged her to the edge of the river, then heaved her up onto the snow. Her body shook so hard her teeth clacked. The cold stung worse now that she was out of the water. He climbed out after her, chest heaving. "Can you walk?" She tried to speak, but just nodded. He stripped off his duster coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling her close to share his body heat. "We need to move. Now." They stumbled into the trees, half frozen and soaked to the bone. Behind them, the sound of hooves grew distant. The riders had not risked the ice. They walked nearly a mile before he found a small rock overhang. He helped her sit down, then broke apart dry twigs with shaking hands and struck a match from a tin. A fire caught. The warmth hit like a fist. She stared at him now, really seeing him. His face was rugged, clean-shaven, blue eyes sharp but kind. His coat was soaked, hair black and matted from the river. He could not have been older than 25. "You saved my life," she whispered. He met her eyes. "Name's Gideon Everett." "You, Raelle?" she said, voice a rasp. "Raelle Ellison." He looked at her, brow furrowed. "Ellison? The ranch up near Elk Creek." She nodded. "It was my father's. They took it after he died last spring." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a flask, handing it to her. "Drink a little. Slow." She took a sip, the whiskey burning her throat. "Why did you help me?" "I was riding the trail. Saw those men chasing you. Then I saw you fall through the ice." His voice softened. "No way in hell I was going to let you die out there." The firelight flickered between them. Her hands had stopped shaking. "They'll come back," she said. "They want me dead." Gideon's jaw clenched. "Not while I am breathing." She stared at him, unsure what to make of this stranger. There was something solid about him, not just in strength, but in the way he had thrown himself into a frozen river for a woman he did not know. He stood and moved to the entrance of the overhang, watching the woods. His boots left wet marks in the snow. Her voice was small. "You could have kept riding." "I could have," he said without looking at her. "But I heard your scream, and I could not ride past that." Raelle pulled the coat tighter around her. Her body hurt, but she was alive. She owed that to him. He turned back to the fire, then crouched beside her. "You are not going back to that town. I have nowhere else." "You do now?" His voice was quiet but sure. "I have a place about 10 miles west. It is safe. You can rest there. We will figure out the rest once you are warm and fed." She looked at him. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because I know what it feels like to have everything ripped away from you." Raelle's breath caught. Gideon reached into his bag again and pulled out a dry shirt. "You need to get out of those wet clothes. I will step outside. Keep near the fire." She nodded, grateful, and watched him step into the snow. By the time he came back, she was wrapped in his shirt and coat, sitting closer to the flames. She looked up. "Thank you, Gideon." He gave a small nod, then eased down beside her. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Raelle leaned her head back against the stone and closed her eyes. But even with exhaustion pulling at her, she felt safe. The first time in months. She opened her eyes. "You really think your place is safe?" He met her gaze. "I built it with my own hands." No one comes near without me knowing. She gave a soft smile. Then I will go. His lips twitched at the corners. Good. That night, they did not speak much more. But when she drifted off by the fire, she felt the weight of him there beside her, watching, guarding. And something in her heart, something scared and broken, began to ease. The sky had lightened just enough to tell east from west when Gideon helped Raelle into the saddle. His horse, a steady buckskin gelding named Boone, didn't flinch as she leaned against its warm neck, her limbs still sluggish from the cold. Gideon mounted behind her, his arms braced firm to keep her upright, and with a quiet nudge of his heel, they set off through the trees. The snow was deeper westward, unbroken but for deer tracks and the occasional rabbit trail. Gideon guided them along a narrow game path, one hand steady on the reins, the other resting lightly against her waist. The silence between them stretched through the morning, broken only by Boone's hooves crunching ice-crusted snow and the slow rustle of wind through bare branches. Raelle stirred, her voice hoarse. Did you build it yourself? Your place. Took me 2 winters, he said without looking down. Started with a sod wall and a borrowed saw. Got the roof on just before the first hard freeze. She was quiet for a moment. Then, why out here? Far enough from town to keep to myself. Close enough to trade when I have to. He glanced toward the ridgeline ahead. And there's water year-round. She leaned her head slightly against his shoulder, the movement small but unguarded. Sounds like you plan to stay a while. Figured I'd earn my quiet. They didn't speak again until the trees gave way to a narrow meadow. Snow lay thick across the clearing, but beneath the white, the shape of a low-roofed cabin stood out against the hillside, smoke curling faint from a stone chimney. A lean-to barn flanked one side, and a split-rail fence curved along the tree-line. Raelle shifted in the saddle. It's real. It's warm, he answered, and brought Boone to a halt. He dismounted, then helped her down carefully, his hands sure at her waist. She stood on her own, but leaned against him as they crossed to the porch. The wood creaked under their weight. He opened the door, and a rush of warmer air met them, scented with pine and old ash. Inside, the space was small but orderly. A cast-iron stove glowed in the corner, fed with fresh coals. Blankets were folded on a bench near the hearth, and shelves along the walls held jars of dried beans, salt, and pickled beets. A rifle hung above the door. Raelle moved slowly to the fire. She didn't speak until she'd lowered herself to the floor beside it, hands stretched toward the heat. You live alone. I do. No one ever visits. Not unless I ask them to. She looked over her shoulder at him. And do you? His eyes met hers, steady. Not until now. She looked away, but her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Gideon took her wet clothes to hang on a drying line near the stove, then fetched a thick blanket and draped it around her shoulders. You can rest here a while. You're safe. I don't sleep easy. Her voice was quiet. You don't have to, he said. Just be warm. He chopped wood outside while she dozed beside the fire. When he came back in, her eyes were open, but she hadn't moved. Her gaze followed him as he stacked the kindling beside the stove. You fought someone once, she said. He looked up. What makes you say that? You move like a man who's had to. Gideon sat across from her, resting his hands on his knees. I was a scout for the army during the war. Tennessee, mostly. You're not from here? She asked. No. Missouri born. Came west after the fighting stopped. She nodded slowly. You've seen too much. So have you. She didn't answer, but her hand tightened around the edge of the blanket. After a pause, she pointed to a tin pan beside the stove. You cook. When I have to. I can make biscuits. And stew. When there's meat. There's salt pork. And potatoes in the root cellar. She nodded once. Then I'll earn my keep. I didn't ask for that. I know. He stood again, then paused. There's a bed through that door if you want to lie down. She looked toward it, then back to the fire. I'll stay here for now. The light helps. He didn't press her. Instead, he settled into a chair near the hearth. The silence returned, not heavy this time, but companionable. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Inside, the warmth grew steady. Raelle's eyes grew heavier, and this time, when sleep took her, it came without fear. Gideon didn't move from his place. He stayed by the fire, his gaze never far from her. The snow deepened overnight. By morning, the trees stood muffled and still, their limbs bowed under the weight. Gideon stepped outside before first light, lantern in hand, to check the trapline. When he returned, his coat dusted white, he carried 2 rabbits and the quiet satisfaction of a man who could still feed his household. Raelle had risen and swept the hearth clean, her hair damp from washing, braided back away from her face. She hadn't asked where he'd gone. She'd simply made space for him by the fire and stirred embers to life. "The wind's shifting," he said, hanging his coat. "Might bring more snow by nightfall." She nodded and reached for one of the rabbits. "I'll dress them." He passed her the skinning knife without comment and watched as she began, hands steady, movements practiced. The silence between them was no longer cautious. It was something shared, like the warmth of the stove or the steam rising from the chipped enamel pot she'd filled with water. "When I was 12, she said without looking up, "my father made me learn to clean game. Said I'd never starve if I knew how to take apart a rabbit." Gideon crouched by the stove and added a piece of wood. He sounded like a hard man. He was fair, didn't talk much, but he listened if you came to him honest. She paused, wiping her hands. "He never read a book in his life, but he taught me to. Sat beside me every evening, sounding out words he couldn't say right." Gideon leaned against the wall. "What was the last thing he said to you?" "That I was too much like my mother." She gave a faint breath. "She died birthing my baby sister. We buried them the same day." He didn't reach for her or speak into the silence that followed. He just waited. Raelle rinsed her hands and set the knife down. I think he was right. She had a stubbornness that didn't bend, no matter how the wind blew. "There's worse things to carry." She glanced at him, then away. "You ever lose someone?" He nodded. "An older brother in the war, and my mother not long after." She waited through months of letters that never came. Raelle turned back to the pot, dropping in bits of salt pork and torn potato. "You talk about them like you still see them." "I do. In the way I hammer a nail. In how I write. Some things don't leave." The stew simmered through midday. They ate it from tin bowls, seated across the table from each other. Her eyes lingered on his hands as he broke bread, and his on the way she leaned into the steam. Later, while she mended a tear in her skirt near the window, he sanded down a broken spindle for the rocking chair she hadn't asked about. The wind rose then, a slow moan through the eaves. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked without turning. "Sometimes," he said, "but I always end up here again." "Why?" He set the wood aside. "Because it's mine. Because no one tells me who I have to be out here." She set the needle down. "That's the first reason I've heard that doesn't sound like running. I did enough running before I built this place." She turned toward him. "So did I." Their eyes held a moment longer than either intended. By dusk, the storm had begun. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, snow blowing sideways. Gideon barred the door and lit the second lantern, the one with the dented top. Raelle stood by the stove, drying her skirt again on the line. Her shoulders looked less guarded in the flickering light. "You trust easy," she said. "No," he answered. "But I trust what I see." "And what is it you see?" He didn't look away. "A woman who crossed a river half dead and still hasn't asked for mercy." She swallowed. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do next, Gideon." "You don't have to know yet." Raelle stepped closer, the hem of her skirt brushing the floorboards. "What if I want to stay?" "Then you stay." He said it without hesitation, and she nodded once, as if something in her had been waiting for that exact shape of answer. They didn't touch. Not yet. But the space between them had shifted, no longer just refuge and firelight, but something gathering heat, slow, certain. Outside, the storm built its silence. Inside, 2 people breathed in the same light. By the 4th day, the storm had sealed the world in silence. Snow lay heavy on the eaves, nearly reaching the lower panes of the cabin's windows. The light that filtered in was pale, the kind that never quite warmed the bones. Inside, the cold had softened into routine: firewood brought in before dawn, coffee boiled dark and bitter, meals carved from what they had. Raelle's hands had found use in the corners of the cabin, mending seams along the bedding, grinding dried corn into meal, scrubbing the soot from the stovepipe with vinegar and a rag. She hadn't asked permission. She simply moved as if the space needed her. Gideon had watched her scatter pine needles across the floor before sweeping them out, slow and deliberate. He hadn't known that scent could feel like something being set right. That morning, she stood at the long counter beneath the front window, cutting strips of cloth from an old shirt she'd found folded in a trunk. Her braid hung loose down her back, and she hummed under her breath, tuneless but steady. "You've got a mind to do something with that?" Gideon asked, nodding at the cloth. "Quilt patches," she said. "Not for anything pretty. Just warm." He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "You always make use of what's left." She didn't look up. "There's never been enough to waste." He crossed the room and opened the cabinet near the stove, pulling out a jar of apple preserves. "I'd trade a whole shelf of this for whatever keeps you from giving up." Her hands paused, the knife resting against her palm. "I think I did give up. That day." She turned to face him. "I didn't expect anyone to come through the trees." He set the jar down. "I didn't expect to see you fall through the river." Raelle's eyes searched his. "You ever think about that moment? What would have happened if you'd been a minute later?" Gideon nodded. "Every night since." She stepped around the table, her fingers brushing the edge. "I still feel the cold sometimes. When I wake, it takes a minute to remember I'm not under that water." "You're not," he said. "You're here." The space between them narrowed. Neither moved. She reached for the scarf around her neck, thin wool that had dried stiff after the river. "I want something to belong to. Not land. Not a name on a deed. Just something that doesn't vanish when I turn my back." Gideon's voice was quiet. "I can't offer much." "I'm not asking for much," she said. "Just truth." He stepped closer, his hand finding hers, warm where their palms met. "Then I'll give you that." Raelle looked down at their joined hands. "I don't scare easy. But this," she exhaled. "It feels like stepping onto thin ice again." He didn't pull away. "Then we move slow. Together." Her fingers tightened around his. "I don't want to be grateful to you. I want to choose you." "You already did," he said, "when you stayed after the storm started." She gave a soft breath, not quite laughter. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything you do." Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, softer this time, a hush over the whitewashed world. Raelle stepped into the circle of his arms, not as someone needing shelter, but as someone offering it. Gideon folded her close, his chin against her temple, the quiet between them deep and full. No words passed for a long moment. Then she murmured, "If we make it to spring, I want to plant beans." He smiled against her hair. "We'll need to clear the west side of the slope." She nodded against his chest. "And build a second stool. I'm not standing to eat every meal." He laughed, low and warm. "Deal." The fire cracked behind them. Snow drifted down. And in the stillness of that cabin, on the edge of the Bitterroot Woods, something took root, not sudden, not wild, but steady and sure. A beginning, chosen. The snow had finally stopped by the 8th day, though the drifts still stood high along the fence, and the trees held ice like glass in their branches. That morning, Raelle stepped outside before Gideon, the cold biting at her cheeks as she walked the narrow path he'd shoveled from the door to the woodpile. She moved slowly, careful of the ice, but her steps were steady. She stood there a long while, looking at the hills beyond the trees. When Gideon joined her, she didn't turn. "There's a bluebird in that pine," she said. "First I've seen since autumn." He followed her gaze. "They don't usually show this early. Maybe it knows something we don't." They stood in silence, watching the small bird flit branch to branch. Gideon reached into his coat, pulled out a folded slip of paper, and handed it to her. "Came from town. I rode in yesterday. Left before you woke." She opened it slowly, her breath catching just once at the name scrawled in the corner. "Luther Kane," she read aloud. "He's gone. Caught crossing into Idaho. Your land's quiet now. No one's looking for you." Raelle's hands tightened on the paper, then folded it small and slipped it into her pocket. "I should feel relief. You don't." "I feel. Still." She looked down at her boots. "I thought I'd be running the rest of my life." "You're not running now." She turned to face him. What does a woman do when she's suddenly free? Anything she wants. That made her smile, a real one, quiet and full. "I want to be useful." "You are. I mean beyond patching quilts and making stew." He stepped closer. "What do you have in mind?" "I was raised working land. I know cattle, I can read the sky, and I'm not afraid of hard soil. You've got more hillside than you use. We could fence in another acre, raise more than rabbits and beans." Gideon nodded. "You don't want to go back? To Elk Creek?" She shook her head. Nothing left there but shadow. She looked up at him, eyes steady. "And you? You built this place for one. Can it stretch to two?" I never planned for it, he said. But I've been thinking about where that second stool might go. Her voice was soft. I want something that lasts, Gideon. He reached for her hand, bare and cold, and wrapped it in his. So do I. They walked back toward the cabin together, the bird taking flight behind them. Inside, the fire still burned low, the scent of ash and pine deep in the air. That night, she took the stool from near the door and placed it beside his at the table. She didn't ask. He didn't question. They shared the bread she baked, and when she reached for his hand again over the table, he didn't let go. 2 weeks later, when the thaw began, they cleared the west slope with axes and rope. Raelle marked rows with stakes and twine, her sleeves rolled high, arms streaked with earth. Gideon built a second tool rack and watched her from the porch, the way she moved like she belonged to the land already. In April, she planted early beans and a row of carrots saved from the root cellar. By May, they built a chicken coop and traded salt pork in town for 2 hens and a rooster. When the first green shoots broke through the dirt, Gideon knelt beside her and ran his fingers through the soil. You made this grow. We did, she corrected, brushing dirt from his cheek with her thumb. That night, with the windows open and the breeze soft through the trees, Raelle stood barefoot on the porch while Gideon lit the last lantern. She looked out at the field they'd cleared, the cabin behind her, the man she'd chosen beside her. Doesn't feel like running anymore, she said. He stepped up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. Feels like staying. She leaned into him, eyes closed. Feels like home. They married in June, with no preacher and no paper, just 2 hands clasped and a promise spoken under the sky. Gideon carved her a ring from a strip of antler and tied it with rawhide until they could trade for silver. She wore it like armor. They built another room onto the cabin before the first frost, stacked the woodpile high, and stored enough dried corn to last them both through 2 winters. By the time the next spring came, the soil turned easier under Raelle's hands, and Gideon had cleared space for a second field. On Sundays, they sat on the porch together, saying little. She'd read aloud from his mother's old Bible, the one with the cracked spine, and he'd listen with his eyes closed, her voice steady as the river they'd crossed once to survive. They didn't speak of the past much. It had shaped them, but it didn't own them. What they built belonged to no one else. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind moved gentle through the pines, Gideon would wake to Raelle's fingers curled against his chest, the warmth of her breath just beneath his chin, and he would know without doubt, without fear, that he had found the thing he'd never dared hope for. A life not alone. A love that stayed.